introduction or see it as much as I would like to. And it's my fault because I do so many mini-series shows between Best of the Bravest, ESU, Bomb Squad that, I play those teams. But tonight we get to hear it for this episode 299. And welcome back to the Mike the New Haven podcast on this Friday night. If you're cold, hopefully you're home and warm now and you're tuning in for what should be a good conversation. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, as we continue our march to 300, that was another volume of, you guessed it, the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's lead. Donald Haid, who was the deputy chief on the job, 41 years in the New York City Fire Department, was the commander of Squad 1 throughout the 90s, majority of the 90s, and also worked in the rescue battalion. That show went out to the memory of the 12 guys from Squad 1 who died on 9/11 heroically that day as they responded. So tonight's going to be a good episode. Quick shout out to, of course, Christian Williams, Joe Maliga, and anybody else watching via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter tonight. But of course, before we get into the conversation, the sponsors, as always, first things first, is MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Had a few clients with that already who have been shocked in a good way at how reasonable the prices are. So if you're looking to get started in media, of course, come my way. And speaking of, here's a great guy. He's a great attorney. If you need a lawyer for anything, hopefully you don't for the criminal side, but whatever the case, go to my man, Joe Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Shout out to my man, Joe. All right, my next guest for a quarter century reported on the happenings of New York City, and she still does, but she did so for a very long time at New York One specifically, and she joined during the station's infancy stage. It started up in 92. She got there in 1995 and covered a lot, as we'll talk about tonight. She's a 1990 graduate of Hofstra with a BA in Communications, and currently is 1/5 of the Five of Us podcast alongside 4 of her other former New York One colleagues. That podcast available anywhere that you can get them. It's great, and we'll talk about that tonight too. And that is the 4th guest from the 5 of us, as I was joking about off air, that is joining us tonight on the Mike the New Haven podcast. And she is Kristen Shaugnessy. Kristen, welcome. How are you?
Mike, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me. And we're going to get Vivian on here too.
Yeah, she's the one holdout. She's the one holdout. So she'll be on eventually.
She's trying to stay away, but you'll get her.
I'll get her. I'll stay on it for sure. So as we were talking off air before we get into everything involving your career, you're a native of Pine Bush. Now, for those not familiar, I know it's in Orange County, but tell me about growing up in a place like that.
It was great. Actually, a lot of firefighters come from Pine Bush because it was a commutable. So, and I have always had an affinity for the FDNY. I just think that they do such a great job, and it's such a hard job, right? So I really appreciate all that they do. But it was it was a one stoplight town. I was long distance on the phone to my best friend. We went to the same high school, but we had about 16 to probably 20 towns and villages go to one high school. It was a regional high school, because if we had just Pine Bush go, there probably would have been 6 of us. So, and we had a party line that we shared with 5 other families. So it's a big difference. It's not far from New York City, but it was a big difference growing up. And I wouldn't have changed a thing. It was really a really great way to grow up.
How far from New York City exactly are we talking, like minutes-wise?
It's about 80 miles. It's outside. It's just past Middletown.
Okay.
But, when we were growing up, we'd always say everything is a half hour away at least. So,
if there's no traffic, you might get in there quicker. But
there is no traffic. Trust me.
Yeah.
Horses and cows, maybe, but no traffic. Tractors.
So tell me, where did the affinity, if at all, for journalism begin for you?
It started I knew when I was 12 that I wanted to be a reporter, which is ironic because I grew up without a television in my house. But my parents always had us read the newspaper. They wanted us to read a lot, and we did. And they liked us to read different sources, so we would figure out where we stood on an issue. So I was, it was like sports and books were kind of my growing up years, which was a lot of fun. So
Mhm. It always starts, and I remember Amanda and I talking about this with the printed word, right? And she told me on this show, respect the power of the written word. And it's
yes,
true because before anything involving television, Mike Lupica is one of my childhood favorites. I
I
read
like,
all his
yeah.
books, and I read his
Mhm.
columns and still do in the Daily News. And I told him that when he was on this show, that it started with him before anybody I ever saw on television. It was him in the Daily News.
He
So
was
for
one for me
you,
too. I have to tell you, he's just such a great writer.
oh yeah, still, and he's still going strong. It's very
Yeah.
poetic how he's able to go about it. So, for you, in terms of the written word, were there certain reporters from certain outlets that you particularly took to?
Well, because we didn't have television, I was writing was,
Mhm.
and it was Connie Chung at the time. She was this, I think she was at CBS, if I remember correctly, but I
I
used
believe
to
so.
watch her and she was one of the first females. And I thought that was impressive that she kind of broke through. And then I would just pick up different reporters on how they wrote and told a story, but mostly on radio, because in radio you have to paint the picture with your words. There's no visual, so it's TV is kind of, it gives you a cop out a little bit because you have all this great video to use, but with radio it's just your words. So if you can paint a picture, then you've told a good story. And some of the best uh, writers that I were the ones that I was in radio with, and they taught me how to be a good writer, concise writer. It was really Stressed at Hofstra. I could not have gotten into television or radio without Hofstra, because from freshman year at the time, I don't know how it is now, but you could walk in and direct a show if you wanted to. And so it was so hands-on, which I needed because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And you take that first TV class and it blows your mind, and then you never watch television the same again. So I remember thinking, oh, I'm so disillusioned now because now I know how all the, how it's all created. So, but
The tricks of the trade.
yeah,
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that because so many people benefit that way. And I'm that way. Like you can
yes,
tell me this is how it's going to be. It isn't until I see it and try it myself through error and through success that I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then it clicks. And
yeah.
hopefully it's still that way because listen, it's a hands-on business in more ways than one. And just before you can even get on the air, so much of what you're describing behind the scenes that needs to happen is so essential in making that show possible in the first place.
Well, I always tell people, like, even if you see a 2-minute piece on the air,
Mhm.
that could have taken anywhere from 2 hours to 25 hours to put together. And it's just 2 minutes. But
Mhm.
it depends because, there's sourcing that has to happen. There's writing, there's, all that different stuff. So you tend to appreciate just a small piece, what goes into it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned radio too, because I go back to baseball. Like, look at a guy like Michael Kay. I go back and listen to the old
Yeah.
Yankee games from the '90s before he got on television. He was
Hmm.
calling games on 77 WABC with John Sterling, and I
I
always
used to listen
noticed
to
that.
them.
Yeah, and they were always, and John's still this way. Michael, not so much anymore because he's on TV. They were always so descriptive, down to the uniform, that you
Mhm.
felt like you were right there. If you were on the drive home, even if you weren't watching it, you knew exactly what was going on because they were so cerebral at perfectly painting that picture. So thank you for mentioning radio too, because it's almost unsung these days.
It is, but it should not be because, I mean, again, going back to my childhood, there were so many nights that I would sit there next to the radio and listen to the games. And
Hmm.
like you said, you felt like you were in the ballpark, right?
Hmm.
And if you had the privilege of getting to the ballpark at some point, you could then take that picture in your mind and put it to what they were describing. And you realize the eloquence of words and what they can create for somebody's imagination.
Hmm. So coming out of Hofstra, we're talking with Kristen Shaugnessy. This is episode 299 of the Mike New Haven podcast. If you have a question in the chat, I should say, fire it away, and at the appropriate time, we'll get to it. There's always that, okay, now what do I do? How do I put this degree to use moment when you're coming out of college? And it can be
Yeah,
daunting for a young kid. Doesn't matter who you are or where you've been. So
right.
for you, what was obviously the main goals to get on television, but what were your circumstances at the time, and what was in your immediate aim in terms of what you wanted to reach for?
So it's much different, right, than it is now, where you can kind of start out in the number one market. It was not like that then. So I sent my tapes, and by tapes, I mean they were like this big at the time. Now they're the size of a credit card, but they were big, and I'd sent them all over the country and heard nothing back. And so then I went to bartending school and I became a bartender. That was actually very strict. I'm like, I went to college. Now I got to go to bartending school. Like you had to learn 72 drinks or something like that. And then the test was they could give you any 7 and you had to make them in a certain amount of time. Anyway, I got my first bartending job the same day I got my first radio job. Thankfully, they were a mile apart. So I would bartend during the day and do radio from late afternoon until early morning, and then do it all over again. And I would just switch in the bathroom and and go to the radio job. So work till like 2 or 3 in the morning and get up and do it again.
When it came to radio, who would you credit early on in your career as being profound influences on you and still continue to influence you to this day?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, there was a guy named Paul Martin who was a great writer. And unfortunately, you know, what you find out in radio is, because I made $5 an hour when I first started, and it's hard to make it. So he left the business, and he was so talented. So that's what you see. You see a lot of great talent. You know, eventually they say they have a family or whatever, and they can't keep doing it. But he was one of the best writers, and he was so patient with me, but he would be like, that's not good enough. And then there was a guy named Terry Donovan, who actually was on the radio. He just moved last year, but he had been on the radio for probably 30 years at least. And he taught me about presence and like knowing when to speak, when to be quiet, how to listen, and how to inflect your voice. So it was all good, because I sounded like Minnie Mouse when I first started. It was awful. I saved tapes, so I guess I thought they were good at the time, and they were not.
Yeah. I feel you. I get it. Because there's episodes from the early days of this show.
Yeah,
you know,
cringy probably, right?
Yeah, from 2018.
I'm sure you weren't, but I was.
Yeah, I know I was. Believe me, I used to sit. Because I didn't know what I was doing. I would sit on the edge of my bed with the tablet recording underneath while I was on speakerphone with somebody. And I listen back from listens 5, almost 6 years ago. I'm like, ugh, like, we'll forget this ever happened. We've come a long way.
It's funny, and somebody had said to me, if you just keep doing this, a woman named Barb Pinto, who actually went on to, she had a career at ABC News. And she said she worked local television, radio too, or television. And she said, it'll just happen. The more you speak, your voice will just change. And so my kids would call that my TV voice, and they hated it, and they still probably hate it. So I'll give you a funny story. When my youngest daughter, Kara, who's now 23, and she was 2, she told me she could read. We were reading one night, and I was like, you can't read, you're 2. And she's like, I know, your voice, because it just would go into the TV voice, right? So she's like, she didn't like it at all. So she pretended she could read. So I would be quiet.
It's tough, and I've noticed that quite a few people have said that they just naturally, because they've been in the business so long, go into those inflections. And it's hilarious to see how they actually talk, and especially if you're from a very ethnic area. I think Diane Macedo was talking about this a while ago, and she's on ABC News now. She's from Long Island. So she had to lose that heavy Long Island girl accent when she got into broadcasting. But she was saying when she gets angry, it comes out. So I don't know how you repress that, especially, and that's the good thing, as we'll talk about a little bit later with New York One. I don't think they were as stringent with that. If that's how you talked, then that's just how you talked.
Yeah, they appreciated you. In the beginning, it was they wanted you for who you were and your journalism, your journalistic chops, as opposed to like what you looked like or what you sounded like even. They just wanted to know you could write, tell the story, and meet a deadline.
They didn't want that Ohio voice, as I call it. And nothing against the Ohio voice. There's certain names that are synonymous with my childhood, as we were talking about tonight. So I appreciate it. Right. But, definitely, if they could just take you for who you are, it makes the job a heck of a lot easier. We had a question, Vic, from Steve Stefanakis, my man, detective and currently in the NYPD Emergency Service Unit, Truck 10 in Queens. He says, would you say the art, Kristen, of storytelling is lost in today's journalism?
I think, you know what? Hi, Steve. And thank you for all your service too. I would say it isn't lost, but you have to know where to look for it, right? Because a lot of it is just not journalism anymore. There's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of just like stories that are fun, but they're not journalism. They're not like what I went into journalism for. So, but I think if you find the person who can tell the story, you know what I've turned to? And I actually love it now. Vivian got me turned on to it when we were in the green room on Sundays mornings. We would like meet, and she would always listen to CBS Sunday Morning, and their storytelling is unbelievable. Like Steve Hartman is probably one of the best on TV. And actually one of my friends who was a photographer in New York, he just got a job as his photographer because his photographer was retiring. So I think it's out there. I don't think the emphasis is on storytelling as much because I think a lot of the media is now owned by corporations who don't really care about news, right? Or they say they do, but they don't have the journalistic background. So that's hard. If you don't know how to tell a story, how are you going to tell somebody to tell a story? So
It's true. It's true. Thank you for the question, Steve. Your Islanders still suck, by the way. So with that being,
I used to work at the Islander. I used to work at the Coliseum, Steve.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, he'll like that. And he says exactly. CBS mornings are amazing, and they are. And we just lost Charles Osgood, and he was a master at that. I could listen to that man could make paint drying sound exciting and intimate, but that guys like that, they're from a lost generation, I feel, and it's still out there. But I think what made it a little bit more complicated, and I don't mean to jump ahead, but it's a great question that Steve asked, is that now we have so many journalists on the street with this.
Right.
And I follow those pages. Loud Labs is one. Here in Connecticut, we have On Scene Media, and I'm not knocking them. They're great.
Right.
But this technology and the boom of it and the fact that you can just record something at the drop of a hat changed the whole ballgame.
It did. And I think it's good and it's bad. The good is I think I'm seeing a lot of like citizen journalists. And if they're responsible, I think that's good, right? Because the more you lose, we're seeing so many layoffs now in journalism. So you need journalists to hold people accountable, right? Otherwise, corruption flourishes, and you don't want that. And also, good stories don't get told either. And I think that should be a thing as well. So you have these citizen journalists who are really like, I'm working with a lot of former Wall Street guys, and we're trying to expose fraud in the financial market. And you see so many people doing due diligence like hardcore reporters. And it is so exciting to me because I'm like, yeah, I love that. And they don't have any journalism background, but because they've been kind of thrust into this and people have been telling them they're uneducated and they don't know what they're talking about, when they know what they're talking about, they really go deep and they find stuff that you cannot believe they find. It's really impressive. So I think it's definitely turns, but if you find the people you trust and you can listen to, then, I think it's okay. But you're right. Everybody has a phone, which I also do not like. The one thing that drives me nuts is like when you see people in like they're taking selfies in bathrooms or they're like they're showing what they're wearing or they're like that's not what you go into journalism for. It's just not.
Right.
So
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. And listen, it's taking pride in there's a fine line, and I agree with you, between taking pride in your appearance. And if you want to take the picture for yourself or whatever, or for a significant other, hey, look what I got today on, what I got on today, honey. That's one thing. That's fine. But if you're putting it out there publicly, I mean, how you going to
and if you're putting it out publicly and you're not putting out stories, I have a huge problem with that. Like if you're doing a combo, I guess, you could say I'm old, whatever. That wouldn't be me. But like I can get that, but do the stories, do the work too.
Right. So because it's a double-edged sword, and without going too down the rabbit hole, you can't complain when you're not taken seriously when you're doing stuff like that. And not every journalist does that, but you know what? Hey, listen, there's some out there. I'm like, it's not a fashion show. Right. I'm glad you love what you're wearing, but what's going on with the stock market?
Yeah, exactly. You look great. What's happening?
Yeah, exactly. So 1995, getting back to your career, is when you get to New York One. Now, as I was saying, and I've covered this before with the previous 4 of the 5 of us, including yourself, that have been on, is that in 95 for you, when you got there, the station had started 3 years prior. So it's still a relatively new operation. And it's competing in a market that has the big 3. It's got ABC, it's got CBS, it's got NBC. I'll throw Fox in there too, that had already established themselves. So for you, was it the prospect? I mean, being in television in New York City is exciting in and of itself. Yeah. But was the factor of being on a station that was so new and so exciting, and everyone seemed to be in this new journey together, even more appealing to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, I was excited. I sent so many resumes and tapes there, and they all got ignored. And then probably Steve Paulus picked it out of the pile and gave me a call, thankfully, just when I had sort of given up hope. And it was an exciting time because everybody was into storytelling. And it was sort of this, like, we're the new kid on the block kind of thing. We were all young. We were all hungry. We all didn't really have great camera presence. I mean, some people did, some people didn't, I mean, I inherited 18 iterations throughout my career or whatever. But it was all about the story you were telling. And the better you could write and the better you could tell the story. That was really that's what drove that place. And it was great.
Yeah, no, of course. And you could see, and I'm glad YouTube is such a treasure trove. It's basically a
Yeah.
time capsule. You
Yeah.
can go back and you can
I
watch
know.
those
That's
those
unfortunate
broadcasts.
sometimes.
But it's great. I'm like, oh my God, look how young Pat Kiernan was. Like, you see all this stuff going on from that particular era. Not only what the stories were, but the presentations, even the commercials, and
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing to behold because people compared New York One in those days to the little engine that could.
Right.
And that's not condescending at all. I mean, that's
No.
what it was, but it was holding its own.
It's funny that you said that because that was like, I think that was a headline somewhere, right? Where it was called The Little Engine That Could. And when I realized, so when I used to start out and, the other stations didn't necessarily want you there at that time, right?
Mm.
And I should say, to get my from radio to television, I had done an internship in college at WNBC. And the photographers there helped me make my tape because I needed a tape to show that I could do television as well from radio. They took their free time and they met me. They put together a tape for me. They edited it for me. It was incredible. And that was a time, again, it was just editing took a lot longer than it does now. And so I've never forgotten that. Like, it's always like pay it forward, right? But on the flip side, when we were at New York One, the photographers were always great to us, but some people weren't thrilled about having New York One around. But I knew it had been accepted when there was one press conference and somebody said, Kristen, you ask the question because they'll answer New York One's question. And I was like, all right, we're there, we're finally accepted. And you know what? We should have to prove ourselves. Like, there was nothing wrong with the way we were treated. I don't think that's kind of you have to pay your dues and you have to earn the recognition. So
I feel like there's a cross, and I've had so many journalism and police conversations on this show where there's that frustration sometimes with both, where it's, oh my God, you don't care about what's going on in this community, because and this is something that Roma talked about as well when she was on, that with these bigger news stations, there's other stories that they're following. They can't get to everything in a day. But it felt like, and even though New York One couldn't get to everything in a day either, because it was so hyper local, there was an attention to detail that the other stations didn't possess, to where I think as a collective, New Yorkers, especially midway through the 90s, were saying, oh, this is really our station. The little things that aren't getting covered, they're big things to us, but they're little things to the stations at large. Not to these guys. We know they'll come out and they'll cover it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a couple advantages there, right? Because, growing up in Orange County, I listened to, listened to CBS, ABC, NBC. Like, when I went to a friend's house, that's all I did was park myself in front of a television and watch the news if I could. So I was invited a lot because I was an easy guest. But when I got to New York One, you're right, because those other stations have to cover Connecticut, Long Island, upstate, everywhere. So and you have a half hour. We had 24 hours and we were just in the 5 boroughs. So you could really hone in on a specific story or get to know a community. And I loved it. It was great. So.
Is there a story, and there was quite a few of them during the 90s, but from your vantage point in that first year or so, that sticks out to you as, man, that was something?
There actually is. There's one, there was a church across from Sloan Kettering on the same side of the street, on the east side of the street. They were just across, and they used to house cancer patients, the families, as they were getting treatment, because there was no hotels there that were fairly reasonable. It was expensive. If you're coming in from out of town, you have to stay over. So they would house them in the church, and there was a kitchen there, and it was communal too, right? Everybody's kind of going through cancer treatment. You could talk to people, you could get to know people. All of a sudden, there was a developer who wanted to turn it into a high-rise, and they couldn't get anybody to listen. And so I did a bunch of the stories on it, and then they held a press conference, and all the stations showed up, and I was kind of proud. I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I've been in from the beginning telling their story because it needed to be told. And it wound up that it was torn down, but there's an interesting story too. It was also owned by a bigger church. And I went to talk to the pastor of that church, and this is a total aside. This is another story I see. I'm going to the building, I see the church, and on the entire side of the building is a Joe Camel ad from the cigarettes. Remember that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm going to the church to talk about the cancer patients that are going to get kicked out from the church, and you have a Joe Camel ad on your building. Like, the whole thing just blew my mind, right? So I actually said to him, I didn't think he was aware that it was there. I wasn't sure. So I said, and the story that I was telling was big enough. So I said, I'll give you a week to get that Joe Camel ad off, and I won't do a story on it. Like, because I don't think he knew. When I brought it up, he was surprised. So took him at his word, and they painted over the Joe Camel ad. So that was a story that never got told, but I felt like, okay.
You made an impact. That's because at the end of the day, what's journalism? It's a public
That's what
service.
it's about, right? It's not just about like, I didn't want a gotcha moment, right? It was hard enough for him to explain why they were tearing down a church and giving it to a developer, and these cancer patients and their families would be left with like nowhere affordable to go. So that was enough of a story.
And they used to, I think they still do this. There will be basically advertisements on the side of buildings in the city.
Yeah.
And there's a great account on Instagram called New York 1990s, where somebody who still lives in the city took basically a series of photos pretty much every day from 1990 to 1999 when they were living in the city. It captures, I'll send it to you later. It captures some of those advertisements. Some of them are conventional DKNY. There's one for Jeter on there. But then you'll see unique ads like that I'm like, why would somebody think that was a good idea to put in a specific building?
I know.
But then again, it's the city.
Yeah, it's true.
Chalk it up to.
You know, you're speaking about Derek Jeter, his ad. When he first came to Yankee Stadium, he had a press conference, and he was young, obviously. And I was on the field for that. So that was kind of a fun moment, too. Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I'm like, he was starting up around that time, 95, 96. And well, there was a big story involving the Yankees in 96 with their World Series victory, which my producer, who's a diehard Atlanta Braves fan, does not want me to bring up, but
let's talk about it.
Yeah. I can see him in the back and he's shaking his head. But I don't know if you covered this at all. 96, you get the crash at TWA Flight 800. And that was big because of the impact it had in the tri-state. Many residents of the city were affected, even though the crash occurred out in Long Island and Mauritius specifically. Any hand in covering that?
Yeah, we were out there we were sent out right when it happened, I think. And then we were out there for days. And it was hard because, it happened offshore. So you couldn't really get access, and everybody was there, all the national news, all the local news. And it was hard to transmit at that point. So you felt like you had so many stories to tell, but you were also sort of isolated there as well. So they always set up, as you know, like, command centers. And so they'd set up the command center, but then the victims' families were being held at a hotel, I think in Queens, So there were different elements of the story. So sometimes you'd wait out there, you'd be out there for 15, 16 hours and you'd get like 2 updates. And so there's this big story going around, but you felt like you weren't telling as much as you could. But that's how that goes. Everybody was waiting for the black boxes.
Yeah. So. Came out later. And that was something that, my goodness, I've talked to my bomb squad friends about, and that was quite the case. It took forever. The final report on that didn't come out until the summer of 2000. And I remember at the time, it's on YouTube as well. Rudy Giuliani called in Imus in the morning at the time when he was still on WFAN and was furious with TWA because they weren't treating the families well for that very reason. They put them out in Queens and weren't updating them. Right.
And they weren't letting, like, I get why they didn't want them near the crash site, but like, there was a lot of anger, right, among the families, and you understood. So they needed an advocate. So,
yeah. Now, later that year, switching to that lighthearted story, it wasn't the first championship that New York wanted to cover. The Rangers, a couple years prior in 1994, had won the Stanley Cup. But this was the first.
Came up into the newsroom.
It did?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
I never knew that.
There's
That's
pictures.
Pretty cool. Okay. I've never seen one. I've seen them get to a final. That was 2014. I've never seen them win one. So hopefully that can change this year. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, but they're looking good.
They're looking good so far, So 96 comes around, and this was a team. They hadn't won a World Series in 18 years. They finally made the playoffs the previous year for the first time since 1981. And that run, which kicked off that dynasty of 4 titles in 5 years.
Yeah.
That's the one people look back on fondly because it was a ragtag bunch. Some very good players on it, some Hall of Famers on it. But the way they captured the city during that October was amazing. You're a baseball fan, you understand, and you got to cover this, especially with Joe Torre being there. He's a Brooklyn boy, his brother being sick at the time in the hospital.
Right, that's right.
What was it like to cover a story that had so many emotional elements to it and ended up in the ultimate triumph?
It's sort of like where you just feel privileged, right, to be that close to it. And, you either do fan reaction or you do, like, if I was early morning, I would do people who are getting to the stadium early, so we cover different facets of it. But it was just fun to be a part of it. And you saw this group of guys and they just gelled, right? Like sometimes you can have all the talent in the world, but if the personalities don't work or whatever, but this worked, and it worked for a long time. So that was a good time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you forget how hard it is, right? Until you don't have it for so long. But they made it
Yeah.
look easy.
Yeah, they had a heck of a run. I mean, they beat a good Texas team. Of course, there's the Jeffrey. By the way, I'm sure New York one had a hand in that whole Jeffrey Mayer story.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, you've done your homework.
I try.
Yeah, that would, who could tell you story after story is Bud Michigan.
Okay,
Right?
I got to try to get him on about that. Yeah, because that was
Yeah.
another one. That was another layer. Here's a kid reaches over the fence, gets
Yeah,
through the home run for
yeah.
Jeter. Yep, ended up turning the whole series around for the Yankees. They won that game. But
Hero or not.
yeah,
Right.
hero or not, he's pushing 40 now.
I
So
know. I was going to say, how old is he now, right?
he was 12 at the time. Got to be in his late 30s now, pushing 40. I think he tried to play pro ball for a little bit, but he lives on in Yankee lore. So,
Yeah.
97 comes around, and I asked this to Roma. I'll ask you the same question. You get in New York is often the crossroads of the world, if not, at worst, it's the crossroads of the country when these stories don't reach as globally as others. Rudy, who's in the middle of, really beginning his second term. He had,
Right.
had a great first term. He's running for re-election, wins it in a landslide, really was turning the city around. Then he has the affair, and then that comes to light. And his wife is in the business. His
Yeah.
wife is on television.
Yeah.
This is not an easy story to cover
No,
as it is.
no. Yeah.
But when you have somebody that's involved, that's, a colleague technically in the business, that was very respected and still is.
Yeah.
What was that like to cover? Because that was delicate with the capital D.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I remember we actually had, again, sort of ragtag in the beginning. We had a young shooter. He's not, he's older now, but at the time he was just starting out. And they tell him to go ask Rudy Giuliani about the affair at a press conference. Well, he didn't know what he was getting into, right? Like, it's just like, here's a question we ask him. I'm like, there's a reason they're not giving the political reporters this question. I mean, it's a landmine, right, that he's stepping on. Anyway, he did, and it didn't go over well, but that definitely spurred things on. And then, you just, as a colleague and as just a human, you really felt bad for Donna Hanover because she was very well respected, is very well respected. And I think she handled it with as much dignity as you could handle it. So I give her a lot of credit because there were a lot of eyes on her. And, I think as best you could handle the situation, she did.
Yeah. And what's funny, and I don't mean in the ha-ha way, I'm like, it's
Right.
kind of like a good for you, girl. She stayed in Gracie Mansion. She didn't leave. She was there for a while. I'm like, all right, good.
She was proving a point, right?
Yeah,
you can do it subtly. You can do it quietly, right?
Mm-hmm. And she sure did. I often ask this to my cops and firemen when I get them on, and I'll ask you the same question as well. I'll tweak it a bit. When was the moment you finally felt comfortable? Like, okay, I think I've proven myself here at New York One.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if you ever feel like that, right? Like you always feel like you have to still do good work because if you don't, like there's always another story to tell and you owe everybody the respect to tell their story. So I don't know if I felt comfortable probably a couple years in, but did I ever feel like I didn't have to work hard or I didn't have to, or I could slack? No, I never felt like that. I always wanted to give 110% to whatever I was doing. So.
Oh yeah, you meet people like that even 25, 30 years or even beyond that into the job, they're still so committed to it. And you love people like that because not only are they committed to it, but they're an example to others and they love to share with others,
Right.
So
and you know
like
what?
that,
I mean,
treasure.
it's a position, a lot of people would want, right? So like you have to treat it with the respect that it deserves and you can't slack because people are relying on you to tell their story or to tell you the facts, right? If it's part of the audience. So you have an obligation. It's not like there's so much. I know people say about TV being in front of the camera. It's not like most of it is behind the camera and it's just like dig, 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 and it's not glamorous, and that's the part that drives you.
Right. No, of course it's being down in the trenches,
Yeah.
and when you look back on it, for as hard as it may have seemed, the more distance you have from times like that, you realize, man, those were some great, great days, and you love it. You look back on it fondly.
Yeah. I mean, there's just some funny stories. I mean, one time I was covering a story, I got stuck in the elevator and, it was a one-man band. I had the gear was really big at that time. And people there were like, they didn't want the press around. So they were like, we're not going to tell anybody you're stuck. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I could be in here forever. There were no pagers or I think we had pagers, but it wasn't going to work in an elevator. I'm like, I could literally be here for a long time because there's another elevator and it's working and they might not tell anybody that I'm here. I eventually got out, but that was kind of funny. So.
Oh yeah, listen, and I don't envy what you guys had to do back then because now it's a lot easier. I mean, yeah, you still have the camera, but things are sometimes shot off phones. You have tripods now. Not back then. You really had to eat your Wheaties back then to carry that equipment around.
That was a good workout.
It was, especially up those New York City stairs and those buildings where the elevator isn't working.
Yeah.
Got to go up 5 flights.
They were rough. Yeah. And usually, I mean, if you went to, like, if you did a crime scene, they typically would shut them down, right? Like you couldn't use them. So. And it was hiking up the stairs with all the gear.
Now, you bring up a good point because I do want to talk about that. As far as crime stories, the fire department's one thing. You're going to a fire scene. A fire, that's about as public as it gets because everybody's on the street watching it. Right. Police investigations are different because there's so much moving. You know, you want to make sure that, or they want to make sure rather, that the evidence is safeguarded. They want to make sure if it's a death, that the family is respected and the deceased is respected. But as far as building relationships with the PD, especially back then when the city was being cleaned up, but a lot was still going on. Right. What was that like for you? And what are some of the more compelling stories that stick out?
I think you have to earn their trust, right? You have to show that you're going to report facts. You're not going to just report anything. You're going to source it a couple times and make sure that what you're telling people is accurate. So I think once you have to prove yourself. So that might take a couple of years. And then you develop relationships with different officers or whatever, and you have your go-tos. It's sort of like anything else, but it is more delicate, especially because if it is a crime scene, you might want to get the story on, and that's the goal. But these are people's lives that are affected. And these, they may have just changed instantly. Like I remember going to like covering some murders, and then you see the family and you're just like, everything, their whole life has just been shattered, right? Like, and so you have to be respectful of that. And it used to drive me crazy when like reporters would shout questions at the family. I didn't do that because I'm just like, I always felt like, how would I feel if I were in that situation? And we had an incident in my family upstate, and I remember the press not being very courteous, and I was like, if I ever do this when I'm older, I will never do that. So
no, it's a good what not to do moment.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There was you want to get the story, but there's a limit to what you'll do.
Yeah, there's a line. I mean, there's a story in the New York Times, and I'm glad they put this in their archive as a lesson as what not to do. There's a fire at Macy's in 1979, and Walter Smith was killed in that fire. He's a New York City firefighter. I think he had about 2 years on the job. Got separated from his company and was later found unresponsive, and he died at the scene. So, it's a solemn process to escort the body of a fallen comrade, into the back of the ambulance. And there's reporters doing what you just said, shouting questions at the firemen, trying to get pictures of firefighter Smith, who's laying there in the stretcher. And, policemen were literally kicking them away and shouting at them, saying, stay away, like have some respect. So there's a line, and it makes the whole profession look bad when you do that.
Yeah. And, I think there was a time, and I think that was interesting with New York One when it first started. Before then, it was sort of like there was that saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Mm-hmm. And that was not New York One at all. Good. We would rather do some kind of like substantive story than just something that's easy, I'm saying, in terms of shooting it and then putting it on because it's got lights and sirens and everything else, and it will catch people's attention. That was not at all what it was about. And that was stressed over and over to us by our bosses.
Yeah, it's about people at the end of the day. And when you're having people in their worst moments, that's a difficult balancing act. And there's a way to do it decently. There's a way to do it not decently. But in watching New York One over the years, I always liked that about you guys. And I'm glad you brought that up. I never felt that it was over the line. I never felt that it was disrespectful.
I think we all just, I think you knew, like, I would always say, how would I feel if I'm in that situation? That's how I would approach it. If I couldn't get an interview because that person definitely didn't want to talk or was like, screaming or something, I wouldn't push it because, as you said, they're people and you want them to not have to worry about me when they have so much else to worry about as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to something else that's more lighthearted, it's the definition of hyperlocal. 2000 Subway Series, Yankees, Mets. City's going crazy. First one since 1956. And the Mets go through the playoffs. They beat the Giants. They beat the Cardinals. Yankees, who had a rough end to the regular season, get it together, take out two really good Oakland and Seattle teams. And here we are. That week, and those games were close. The city was eating it up. What
Yes.
was your perspective in covering that?
You're just thrilled to be there, right? Like you're just so excited because, and Subway series became more and more familiar, right? But there was a time when it was like, I felt like this is the first one of that kind, of that magnitude, right? So it was something, especially with the media the way it was, because there was more access and everybody was into it. So, and it was fun because with the Mets, you'd take the train and, the Yankees should drive, but like trying to get into the stadium is fun and all the stores around it, it was a good time.
Yeah, and then Roger Clemens tried to murder Mike Piazza, with the bat. So
Well,
there was
there's
that.
I didn't get that.
Well,
Could you
yeah.
try again?
That is
Siri agrees.
Siri agrees. I don't know why she's talking so loud.
I'm not sure I
Oh,
understand.
sorry. I don't know where she's
Live
going.
podcasting at its finest. Well, you tick around with Siri. No, you're good. Let me give a shout out to our friends in the live chat tuning in. Siri, of course, I'll give a shout out to her. Thanks for being here, Siri. We appreciate your presence. Pete Pranzo, he's watching tonight, a retired NYPD street crime lieutenant, good guy. And he's been on the show before, and an author to match as well, and a very good one. Tony Edward, he's tuning in. And Billy Ryan, another retired NYPD detective and one of the sponsors of the show. Good to see you always. Billy, of course, he's a big supporter of the show. Now, this I did want to bring up with you.
Yeah.
Something
and thank you all
was-
for your service, I should say, because really respect that and appreciate it.
Oh, for sure. Thank you. I echo those sentiments completely. And shout out to those guys for being big supporters of the show and for what they've done over the years. Totally agree with that sentiment. So one thing I did want to bring up with you is another very personal story. The year after, right? 2000, we go from something that's so great, the Subway Series, Yankees, Mets, and who would have thought a year later we get something like 9/11.
Yeah.
You were right in the thick of it that morning. So I'll let you take it from here. How did that day start for you?
It was primary day in Brooklyn. And we were covering primary day. So we were very short staffed because everybody was geared toward the night when the results were coming in. And so this is when you didn't really think Mayor Bloomberg was going to win, right? Or Bloomberg was going to win. But it was a really beautiful day. I remember that. My photographer and he was my live truck operator. So usually you'd have a crew of 3 when you're doing morning live shots. It was just the 2 of us. So we had put a whole bunch of wire. You have to wire the school that we were in to get to and it was in the back of the school. We did all the wiring and then we got the call and we thought it was a joke because they knew how much, we had to do to set that up. And it wasn't. And then we got we wrapped it up real quick and then we got in and we were in Brooklyn. And then we were we were by the Manhattan Bridge and it was closed, but there was a fire truck going over and they said, follow us. We had worked with them obviously on the job and it was just the fire truck and our live truck. And while we were on the streets of Brooklyn, just getting to the bridge, people were all throughout the streets and they were asking us at lights, what's happening? We're we don't know. And then we heard that second plane had come and that's when we knew, you just knew it was terrorists. And so we went and we lost the fire truck right around City Hall because they were able to get, unfortunately, to the Trade Center. And then I just ran from there. And they said I'd meet a photographer, which I never did. I went up to the command center. And then they told me, they're you got to get back. Because I wanted to go up into the tower. And but we were seeing things that, you knew how bad it was. And in my head, I'm thinking, how much am I going to report? How much am I going to leave out? Because you knew there were probably families wondering because of everything you were seeing. And it was different. The command center was different that day. I mean, those were guys that had so many years on the job, were so well respected. And it just felt different. And so I went to a payphone. They told me to get far away. And of course, the reporter in me, I'm going to go right here to the nearest payphone. And that's when I was live on the air. And then the building just started coming down. So I was live and then I had to make that decision. I'm I don't know if they know how bad it is, but you're starting to get kind of pummeled with debris. And so there was an FBI agent who was near me and he said, we got to run. And he was running. It wasn't he was sticking around because if he stuck around, I would have been okay, I'll stay. And so it was strange because at the time, people were in the buildings. And I think the West Side High was very crowded at the time from what I hear from Amanda and my other colleagues. But where we were, there was nobody because you were either like the command center or like right at the towers and on the West Side Highway, probably because that's where you could park all the trucks and everything, or people had run. So like when we were coming over the Manhattan Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge was packed with people, like wall to wall people. So people had either gotten away but nobody was in that area. So when we started running, we caught up to the masses. And that's when it was, but then you saw they had so many emergency services out and cots and stuff waiting, stretchers waiting for people, and nobody came. And then I ran into 2 retired firefighters. I don't know their names. They were retired. They had just answered the call, as firefighters do, right? Like no matter what, they go. And they said, Father Judge has died. And I'm like, there's no way. I just saw him. Like that cannot be. And that's when you realize, and they were trying to describe like digging, they got buried, and they were trying to describe like, digging themselves out. And it all happened so quickly. So a lot of it didn't make sense at the time. And then it started to, as you understood what was happening. So,
yeah, but I mean, it's true. Peter Jennings had said this in one of the last interviews he did before he died in 2005, that he's like, now it all seems so clear. Plane hits building, building falls down, building falls down. But when you're in it in the moment, it was anything but.
And the rumors were rampant. Like I was hearing the Liberty Bell was hit. I mean, I was hearing Boston Harbor got hit. I mean, so everybody was telling me a different rumor. And in my head, and Sharon Diesenhaus, who was an anchor at the time, also said this. It was like, report what you know, do not report what you don't know, because there were like whatever you can verify, but do not give people false information, because this is bad enough and they don't need us contributing to the panic and the hysteria that's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And I'm glad you mentioned the command post, because at that command post for the FDNY was Bill Feehan, who was the number 2 at the time in the FDNY deputy commissioner, and Pete Gansey, who was the chief of department. And somebody, Dan Nigro, told me this story. He was there too when he came on a little while ago. That an engineer came up to them and said, these buildings can come down, right? And Chief Gansey kind of turned around and said that. And he's like, well, they didn't think that they could fall that quickly. But
that's interesting, because I've said this before, and I don't even know how to describe it, but like there was something different in their eyes when they were telling me to get back. So I wonder if that's like after they heard that, right? Because I wanted to go up, and they're like, they're not going up. They're like, and there was just something different, and they were still fully in command, as they always are at the command center. Like it's always where you feel like they're under control, you're safe, the whole thing. But there was something different about that command center, certainly.
And of that command post, the only one that survived that day was Nigro. And I recall just the last note on that day, Chief Jay Jonas, another one who survived it, he was in the lobby just getting ready to go up with his men. Yeah. And he's standing next to Jerry Nevins from Rescue One. Great guy, great firefighter, and a few other guys. And Jerry turns to Jay Jonas, and he's like, oh my God, after the second plane hit, we might not live through this. And so they all shook hands and said, I don't know if we'll see you guys again, but it's been nice knowing you. And of that group, Jay's the only one that's still with us.
And to think you have people who will do that job for everyone else is just, you can't thank them enough, right?
Mm-hmm. So. No, of course, and from the aftermath of that day, was it heartbreaking? Of course, but there were uplifting stories too. So from that late 2001, early 2002 period, tell me about some of the more important stories you were able to tell about the recovery process.
Oh, that's interesting. You know what? I went down to the site a little bit, but I think they were sort of nervous to send me back down to the site too often because of everything. I was fine to go back down there, but I actually started covering the fire department, and I covered the stories of people who had passed, and a lot of families invited us in and wanted to tell the stories of their loved one. And I was very like, if you didn't want to tell your story, I was not going to push you at all, because that's not what, but if you wanted to, and you wanted to put their pictures on TV and remember them and tell me about them, I was very grateful to everybody who did that. And I understood why people didn't do it if they didn't want to. Mm-hmm. But, and that was sort of cathartic too, just for like, because everybody was mourning, right, in their own way. And so it was I met some wonderful widows who, I know one woman who I stayed in touch with, she adopted a daughter. He was the love of her life. And, so it was, you build those bonds, and there are those that come from it. And a lot of people did great things. In fact, during the pandemic, my news director came to me and said, what are we missing? And I said, well, I'll just tell you, after 9/11, there were a lot of good things that were happening. And we were so focused on, because there was so much, right? There were so many stories to tell, but there were also good things that were happening. And if you can give people a little bit of hope in those times, I think that's important. So I actually started doing this thing. I said, let's just name it acts of kindness. And that's what I did during the pandemic. And it was because of my experience on 9/11.
Yeah, it all tied together. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that wasn't easy to cover either, especially since we were all locked down. This was an event that, 9/11 obviously had lasting ramifications, but it was an event that, considering it happened within the span of 2 hours in the morning, it was about sorting out the aftermath. This was such a prolonged thing that I'm glad stories like that came out, because it kept us sane, for lack of a better way to word it.
Yeah, it's true.
Definitely, for sure. We're talking with Kristen Shaugnessy here in the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is episode 299. And shout out to Steve Iorato and Jake Rickson. Yeah,
congrats.
One away from the milestone. So there's other stories that are happening throughout the decade. There's the summer blackout in 2003, which was interesting to say the least. And other ones, Giants in the Super Bowl in 2007. And as this is happening, you're at a point where, oh, wow, I got, 10 years here. Oh, wow, I got 15 years here. So you're in a position where you're still so invested in what you're doing, but you could take the time to mentor others and train others, because now you're the one they're looking to that's been there and done that. So for you, what were the mentorship keys, and who did you most enjoy mentoring that went on to do great things?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know who would say I mentored them. I tried to be kind and helpful to anybody, really, like if they wanted questions. There was, I should tell you, the one was Lauren Chickalis, who my daughter had a teacher and her daughter wanted to get into media. And she didn't even know I worked for like the first 8 months that Jamie was in her class. But then she said, oh, I heard you do this. This was like in April or whatever, May of that year. I'm like, oh yeah, I do. And so I had her daughter in, and she interned with us. And then she was at Penn State at the time, and she called me, and she really wanted to be on Z100. That was her goal. And Elvis offered her a job. And she said, but I'm not graduated. I'm like, you got to take it. Doesn't matter. Figure it out. But these opportunities do not come along. And she did. So that's probably the biggest one.
Yeah. Elvis Duran, I will not tolerate any slander against that man. He's a goat. No, he is the legend. He is definitely. He's one of those synonymous names with New York radio. So I'm definitely glad he's still going.
See, I didn't even say his last name, and you knew who I was talking about.
Exactly. There's Stern, there's Imus, and then there's a guy like Elvis Duran for sure. So thank you for mentioning him. And along the years, again, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You don't look at it that way when you're in it and you're invested in what you're doing, but there's times when you have times to reflect on what you've done and how far you've come. So I don't know how much those milestones meant to you in the moment, or, maybe you look back on them now more so that you're removed from it. But looking back, when you got to those milestone years, what was the significance of that personally and professionally for you?
I think longevity in that job it can be hard when you're trying to, originally I had wanted to be like an overseas war correspondent. That sort of was what I wanted to do. But then when you have kids, that changes, right? So then your goals shift a little bit. But to be able to maintain a household where your kids are happy, and even though you're working crazy hours and whatever, that was significant. And to have a 25 year, and then it turned into, like, with radio and stuff, it wound up to be about 32 years. So that's a pretty good run.
Yeah, a very good run, and a lot to be proud of during that time. 2011 and 2012 is interesting, though, because we get hit with Irene and Sandy back to back, as I talked about before. So Irene, it knocked us for a bit of a loop, but it wasn't that bad, at least for most of us. Some parts got it bad, but not too much. And then Sandy came and said, Irene may have missed you, but I'm not going to.
Here I am. Yeah.
And that was pretty chaotic. Again, another hyper-local story like 9/11 was. So many people are getting affected by this, and it's such an adverse event. So covering that, and that was 17th year in New York One at the time. What do you recall from that period, late 2012, early 2013?
You know what? A lot of my colleagues were really in, like, harm's way there. I was not, and grateful for that. But you felt for, like, when you went out and saw the devastation and just people waiting on lines for just food or whatever, it's heartbreaking when you do that. I remember I went to one of the public housing buildings down in Lower Manhattan, and they were trying to tell them to get out, but where do you go, right? Like, if you don't have anywhere else to go, what do you do? And now you're just waiting for, like, sort of impending doom. And that's an awful feeling, right? Because if you've got kids, or you don't have food, or whatever it is. So there were all those stories. So that was difficult. And then, we had colleagues who were just like out in the thick of the storm. And, I know Janine and Amanda had stories and Rocco had stories. They were really, it was a struggle to cover that story. So they sort of put their personal safety, but that's what cops and firefighters do all the time. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And, I will ask you this as well. Some people, especially if you're able to get to a point in your career where you're doing both, some people like the gumshoe reporting where you're out in the field every day
Yeah.
and you're not really in the newsroom that often, except for meetings or you're coming back to file your story. Some people like being behind the anchor desk, especially if you have enough tenure on. Like I said, you got to do both. Did you have a preference to one or did you not care?
I love doing both. I like the mix because I feel like if I was just a solo anchor, I don't think I would have ever taken it for granted, but it's hard in different ways, but reporting is taxing, right? Like it's all the things, right? It's just trying to tell a good story, limited resources, where are you going to even eat or find a bathroom, like all those things. You're out in the elements. It's all that. And then the anchor desk is sort of cushy in that way, right? It just is. And you have a lot of people helping you. Whereas when you're reporting, it's you and your photographer. And that's sort of a bonding experience too. So I like the mix because I felt like I could appreciate what everybody brought to the table in the newsroom. Whereas I think if you're just behind the anchor desk, you don't necessarily appreciate all the things that are happening. In fact, I remember early in my career, I said to our news director, we should probably have like the assignment editors go out. I remember there was like one time when they were like, I was a night report at the time and I was on Staten Island, was covering, there were wildfires early on and was covering those. And it was like 10 o'clock or something. And then at night, and they wanted me to be in the Bronx because there was like something that happened for an 11 o'clock live shot. I'm like, do you guys know on the map, like where Staten Island is in the Bronx? Like, gee, we got to break down, we got to set up, but I was new. So I didn't want to like make waves, but I'm like, you don't quite understand what you're asking. So I think it's good to know what other people do. And I think doing that mix allowed me to work with a lot of people and it allowed me to appreciate everyone from, the custodian who kept the newsroom clean because I'd see him at 2 a.m. and nobody even knew he was around. And here he is keeping our surroundings clean, to the guys in the equipment room who were making sure all our gear was in working order, to the truck ops who, really have to know their way around the city and they have to set up quickly and break down quickly. And, sometimes people would say like, hey, tell your photographer. I'm like, he's got a name, or she has a name. So let's address them by their name. So that's my answer for that.
Yeah. No, you're the second person to bring that up. The other one was Alex Dennis, which is like, learn their names. And she was serious about this. Like, I hate when people say, hey, you,
Oh, yeah. And learn a little bit about their story, right? Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. Where they're from, why they're there. Because it's the little things like that. And you have talked about this in the five of us that increase the morale. And there's such basic things to do. They don't cost a thing. But it's so many bosses don't do it. Exactly. Yeah. It's so easy.
Yeah.
So easy.
Yeah, I still remember there was a story that I covered in the Bronx. I forget, I don't even know what the story was, but I do remember, and my kids remember this too, because I went home, it was Christmas time. Mm-hmm. And she was so proud. She didn't have a ton of money, but she had a happy family and like their tablecloth was newspaper. And like she had set up a table for like, because she's like, I knew you were coming. And it was like, and that has stayed with me. I'm like, that is awesome. Like I love that because she was so proud and it just, I don't know. So those things stay with you too.
It's the little things. So you reached the end of the line with New York One at the end of 2020, going into 2021. For those of you that want to research that, you can. But we're not going to discuss.
There's a couple headlines there.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple headlines there. We're not going to bring them up on this show. But, and again, you talked about this in the trailer for the five of us, that 9-minute episode that you guys did, where there was that transition where it's like, all right, well, now what do I do? And you've dipped your toes in a lot of different projects, which, you can talk about here. So, and even the little things. You talked about walking a few miles a day. You talked about covering a few different places down in the Carolinas. You've kept busy.
Well, you're trying to figure out who you are, right? Like, I think I always had a good balance. Like I always appreciated everything. Like I think if you experience things, you appreciate things. So it wasn't that, and I never defined myself by being a TV reporter or an anchor. That wasn't it, but I worked a lot. So to not have those hours and to fill those is different. So I think it took all of us a little bit, but it was nice to have to go through it together. And I think we all hit those points. Like if somebody was having a rough day, we're constantly chatting or whatever. We have a text string, and somebody else would be in a good part. So we'd pick each other up. And so it was interesting. And then we all started developing different interests. I remember Amanda saying, Dave, her husband, had said to her, like, what's your hobby? And she called me and she's like, what's your hobby? I'm like, I don't have one. Like, it was work. Like, that's my hobby. My kids, my work, my husband. Like, that's what it is. So she's like, yeah, I like to read. I'm like, me too. But is that a hobby? So like, you have to find different things. So now I'm playing a lot of pickleball and I'm working with these financial guys. So yeah, I feel like my husband says you have a lot of jobs now, but nothing like, assigned. So
following you as I do, particularly on LinkedIn, you have been posting so much about that. And I don't mind. Like I say it all the time. And I'm not really like a finance bro. I can't really describe myself as being interested in that. But naturally, it's good to stay abreast of these things. Yeah. So I do click on the articles you're posting. And I'm like, so what prompted this?
Well, okay. So I had been posting on Twitter like constantly because there's a whole community there that's doing all this due diligence. But then I realized most people don't even know this is happening. So then I'm like, let me bring it to LinkedIn and just see what the response is. And it's, it's gaining a little bit of traction, not as much as on Twitter, but my mom passed away in 2018 from multiple myeloma. And thank you. But I started like looking at companies. I had always invested, but I was always like so-called safe stocks. Now I know there's no safe stocks, but there were like these small companies that were doing great things. I'm like, somebody has to be working on this. Like this just can't, like how long have we been dealing with cancer and how long so I found these small companies and they're so-called penny stocks, which, my parents always taught us, like, you got to be financially independent. You've got to do, you got to be smart with your money. So I knew all that, but I'm like, they always tell you to stay away from penny stocks. And then I hooked up with these former Wall Street guys who have been fighting fraud in the market. One guy for 24 years. And I realized, like, yes, they're risky, but the problem is they're being purposely destroyed. Some of these companies that are doing like mind-blowing research. I'll give you an example, and if I'm boring you, you can tell me to stop. But
you're not. Go ahead.
There's a company that had a great phase 3 trial for glioblastoma, which is the most common and aggressive form of brain cancer. Mm-hmm. And the life expectancy for that glioblastoma is not long. It's very short. This extended your life by a significant amount. Still not great, but a significant amount. And so you're like, this is great. It was such hope for so many families. So they announced this at the National Academy of Sciences, I believe. It was I think it was in 2021 or 2022. 21, I think. So the stock is only $2 at the time. Now, how is that possible, right? So there's something nefarious going on anyway in it. During and after the announcement, you would expect, when you're making a great announcement, what would you expect to happen to the stock price? It's going to go shooting up, right?
Right.
It was at $2 and something. It went down to 34 cents.
It tanked.
Yeah. Wow. And it was on purpose. And it's because we have all these counterfeit shares flooding our financial markets. And when they go offshore, apparently, we have been told that they don't count them anymore. And you start back and they don't keep track of them. So my concern is about the entire financial structure of like everything. It feels like a house of cards to me now. And it keeps me up at night. But the only thing we can do, we've like educated thousands of people over the last couple of years. And we continue to do that. And you feel like if sort of like that Prel commercial, I think it was, right? Like if you tell one person and I tell one person, so it's that. Yeah. But we got a congressman involved today who he is calling for a public hearing on a different stock because the answers at FINRA and the SEC hasn't even answered, even though Congress demanded an answer by yesterday, the 31st. And FINRA answered, but did not really answer. So he's going to ask for a subpoena and a public hearing. So I feel like we're making some progress.
It sounds like it. You were
Yeah.
very vocal during the whole SBF controversy, and that really blew the lid off everything,
Yeah.
considering the fact he had so many high-end connections. He
Yeah.
seemed like a legit guy. I think he even did a few Super Bowl commercials. I mean, Tom Brady was
Yeah.
involved in his product. So here's a guy that, oh yeah, conventional businessman, turns out to be one of the biggest fraudsters we've seen in the
Yeah.
last, really since the century began, with the exception of maybe Bernie Madoff.
Yeah.
So you would think after something like that, that people's eyes would be a lot more open. But I feel, and while that's the case for some people, like with a lot of major headlines, it catches our attention for a while and then it fades away and we're on to the next thing. But you stayed
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's too big not to. When we were going through what we went through, I remember Janine was the first to say, like, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And then you have a choice to make. Do you stick your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, or do you call it out? And it's the same thing that goes here. So I'm seeing this fraud, and there should be people going to prison, and they're being protected, and they're being protected at the highest level, and it drives me crazy. So
I can understand.
yeah, so
No, it's
we'll
corruption.
keep fighting.
Yeah. And what's journalism at the end of the day? Speaking the truth to power, as many have
Right.
said. So
Right.
that's exactly what you're doing. Now, speaking of, you guys have had the five of us, and it's been mentioned a lot. You're working on a book, and I can't wait for that book to come out. But each episode is kind of like a prelude. It's kind of like a preview of the book. So
Yeah.
this is a two-layered question, and I'll ask the first
Okay.
layer of it, which is starting a podcast is not easy. You have a great support system, but a lot of people are in the space, and so you have to stand out. Besides the book, what prompted the idea of the five of you getting together and doing a show that's taken off and has done very well?
I think because we knew we had a lot of information that seemed just natural to us because of our experience in our careers. Like we had a combined 150 years or so of experience. And there's so many things that you learn that you don't even realize, like, oh, people don't know that, right? So even like when my daughter was negotiating for a raise one time, and she got it, but I gave her tips and she's like, oh, I didn't know that, So and just people deal with good bosses, bad bosses. If you're laid off, we just did one, our most recent one that will be coming out. We did nice versus kind in the workplace, which I was like, I don't know where we're going to go with this, but it actually turned into a good podcast because it's different, and then the other one was, there were like 82,000 layoffs in January. So we talked about that. There was a woman who had recorded she knew she was going to be laid off because her whole team had been. So she prepared. So she recorded it and it went viral to the point where the CEO had to respond to it because it was such like a robotic response from HR. And she was basically like, you're destroying people's lives, right? You're not acting, you're going to go home and eat dinner, but this is like, you're impacting people's lives. And tell me why. And they tried to say it was her work performance. It wasn't. They couldn't give her any statistics. It was just, they were downsizing. And so that went viral. And obviously if it goes viral, it's relatable for people, unfortunately. So we did one on that.
Now, without giving too many details away, as this book has been progressing for the five of you, what's the latest on it? What can we expect?
So we have interviewed a lot of people like around the world, actually. And it's interesting. It doesn't matter what industry they're in. It's all sort of the same, what you deal with at work. So I'll give you an example. There was a woman I talked to. She was at a tech company. She was so happy. Immigrant family. Her father had worked there for years. And she had gotten to she's like, that's where she wanted to work. She worked her way up. She was in the room, right? Like she's in the back room in the meetings. And then she called something out. And all of a sudden, everything changed. And she had been working on a big project, whatever, somebody had been taking credit for it. And I told her exactly what was going to happen. And she's like, I don't think so. And like, they're not this company. Like, I know this company. I'm like, I hope it doesn't, but I'm telling you that this, and she called me back, unfortunately, and I'm not laughing because it wasn't funny, but she's like, it happened exactly like you said it would. I'm like, yeah, because a lot of times corporations are the same. So, I think we have much less naivete than we might have when we were 20 or something, when I was always told, if you work hard, you can be anything you want to be. You can work as long as you want. Well, that's not necessarily true. So, so we bring that to the table too.
No, and it's been a great education for me, especially as a young guy just entering the workforce. I've been working for almost a year with my fire department gig, and I love it. But even though I love it, I'm always conscientious of this is what can happen.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what can take place if you're not careful, if you're not watchful. So that's why I think you see, and this was something that was starting before COVID, you see a lot of people with side hustles to where
Yeah.
if it hits the fan with your day job, they have something to fall back on and keep making that money.
Which is so smart because we didn't have a plan B, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem. And Janine kept telling everybody, she's like the business brain. And she was
Oh
like,
yeah.
everybody needs a plan B. Everybody needs a plan B. And I'm like, Amanda and I are trying to figure out what our hobbies are. We're so far behind eight ball. We're just like worker bees and we're going to work till we're 65 and blah, blah, blah. So we have all learned that, you might love your company, but don't be married to your company or your career. Like you might love your career. At some point, your career is not going to love you back. So you got to be careful and ready for the day.
And that's true. And that's why even now, like I've started up the consulting company.
Yeah.
This podcast monetizes, so I'm working on different projects to where, listen, I get it. I was without a job for 3 years after college,
Wow,
because of COVID, which jacked up everything. So I understand.
That's a hard time to,
Yeah, that was not fun. So, listen, it's good. I'm glad that you guys have landed on your feet and have continued to work in that because, those plan Bs, plan Cs, plan Ds, you want to make sure you have them in this life.
Yeah. And I think what you're always surprised at, like, this would have never happened. Like, I would never be doing what I'm doing now. So and I'm like learning every day. So I like that. But I would have just been doing the same thing till I was 65 and I would have been happy doing it, right? Like I would have been excited by the stories, but there's something else out there for everybody. So those next chapters, once you kind of embrace them after you like resist and go through all the emotions, because there is a range of emotions, then it can be really good if you're open to the possibilities.
Oh, yeah. And that's exactly like going back to my police and fire interviews that I've done on this show. The one common theme both said to me is they tell this to all the guys out there on the job currently all the time. Guys, remember, there's life after the job.
Yeah.
You can love it, but when you retire, make sure you have other hobbies lined up because otherwise, some people crash and burn. But if you have those hobbies lined up, the transition, I should say, is a heck of a lot easier.
Yeah. I think Amanda said that on one of our podcasts. She's like, it's sort of like you're young, you're starting out with a career, then you have kids, then you're married, and then they grow up, and then you finish, and then you die. Like that's, she's like, that's the thing. And when you put it like that, it's sort of like, okay, well, where's the living part of that, right? You have to, like, I thoroughly enjoyed most of my career, right? Like the bulk of it, I really loved what I did and loved who I worked with. So there's that, but now it's like a different stage. I remember my husband saying to me, like, I'm 55 now. He's like, we got to live. Like, you don't want to wait until you're just about feeling like you're going to fall apart to like start living. You want to do it while you can. So it's been good.
No shame in that. No shame in that. The hour has flown by, and I said we would keep it to 90 minutes and under, and we did it, but it doesn't even feel like we've been talking for an hour 12, which we have. Now it's time for the rapid fire, which is 5 hit and run questions from me. 5 hit and run answers from you, I should say. You could say pass if you want, and we'll start firstly with, and if you want to say multiple here, you can. Favorite interview you've ever done?
That's a good question. It would probably be just, I don't have a specific, but it would just be sort of like an everyday person where I'm learning their story. That would be what it is. Like not some big name or something. It would be that, like somebody who I've learned something from. But I can't think of a name right now, but that would be what it is.
Man on the street type interview?
Yeah. Yeah. Just somebody who's like, you're like, wow, they make you think. So.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Second interview you wish you could have done?
Oh, there's a lot of those. I mean, any number of people. I would like to right now. I would like to interview people at the top of the finance chain, right? So there's a lot of interviews I want to do. I would like to interview. Here's what I think. I think everybody has a story, so I am always interested in people's stories. So there's not one that I'd want to do. I just kind of want to know, like, what makes people tick and
exactly. No, listen, I'm the same way. There's quite a few. There's quite a few that I feel that way about. Third, funniest story you've ever covered.
The what one?
Funniest story you've ever covered.
Oh, funniest one. Oh, this isn't funny because the story wasn't funny, but this guy, I was covering like a serious story, and he was like in his apartment, like cooking up like eggs and stuff, like cracking eggs, like buying a dozen eggs, and then he'd come from behind you, and like he would, it's a little scary when you think about it, but then he would like crack them behind you and then run away. And then he would put it on tape. And so like, by the time I got back to the newsroom, they're like, you've been spoofed. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it's a little unnerving when it's happening in your live because you can't react. But that was, I mean, it was funny. And the other story that wasn't funny, but it was interesting was he was having an episode, so it wasn't funny, but to try to maintain your composure, and he's completely like stripping down, and you're doing a live shot and you can't say anything. And like, this guy is just totally stripping down. I'm like, and I got to pretend like I'm serious. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is wild. So what's that?
Nothing to see here, folks.
Yeah, nothing here.
Fourth, after a long day of reporting, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, Malio's.
Where's that at?
Right by the garden.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Midtown.
Yeah.
All right. A spot that if I ever go back to a Ranger or Knick game, I would have to see.
It's a Ranger spot.
All right. There you go. Even better.
Yeah.
All right. Fifth and finally, what advice would you give anyone looking to enter your profession?
Worry just about telling the facts and worry about the writing. Don't worry about the other stuff, because that you can work on, but the writing is critical, and the facts. But it's also just a very changing industry, so I probably would steer people away from it.
Yeah, listen, that's an honest answer. I get it. I get similar answers like that. So I understand where you're coming from. It's definitely a changing industry. This has been great. Stick around. We'll talk off air. But before we say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything that you would like to give?
Thank you to the NYPD, the FDNY, and to you, Mike and Vic, for doing this, because I think it's important. And to anybody who's watching, I appreciate it.
All right. My shout out, I mentioned this off air. I'm going to mention it on air. So my man, Dan Cohn, he did 31 years between the NYPD and Suffolk County PD, worked in the emergency service unit of the NYPD in Truck 2, and also out in Suffolk County as well. He just retired after a long career. He was on the show previously. So I just wanted to shout him out. Well deserved. And now he can coach his kids' sports.
I love that. Congratulations, Dan. Yeah. That's
Congratulations
awesome.
to Dan. If there was ever a guy that earned that, it's definitely him. Just a great
guy.
What
a great thing to be doing, to watch his kids grow up. That's nice. I like it.
Mm-hmm. And as they often say about guys like Dan, he was indeed the real police. So shout out to you, Dan. Much love to your brother. All right. Well, this has been a great episode. Like I said, stick around. We'll talk off air. Shout out to everyone who tuned in tonight via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and will watch this or listen to this later. All right. So the next episode is the milestone. It's episode 300. The 300th episode will air live this Wednesday at 7 p.m. And it's funny that you're on tonight, because Amanda was the one that helped me get this guest. He's currently the New York City New York City Fire Department, Chief of Department, highest ranking uniformed member in the entire FDNY. And that is going to be John Hodgins for volume 54 of the Best, the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. We always swing big for those episodes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get much bigger.
I'm honored to be just before John. So thank you.
No problem at all.
Yeah. Enjoy that one.
I will. Like I said, there's a 5 of us link, because who helped me get that interview but Amanda. So she came through for me. So shout out to her.
Like that.
Yeah, she definitely is. So shout out to her. And I'm looking forward to that one. 300 this Wednesday live at 7 p.m. In the meantime, on behalf of Kristen Shaugnessy and producer Vic, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Have a great night, everybody, and a great weekend.